Good evening. I'm Peter Haslam. Welcome to Global Dialogues. This is a program dedicated to an examination of how we can be active locally in and about global affairs. Tonight's guest is Mona Sheikh. She's from Copenhagen University, and she's here with the Orfila Center for Global and International Studies as a research fellow doing work on the Taliban and why they are, who they are, what they do, and how we might respond to them. Welcome, Mona. I'm delighted that you're here and to help us understand the Taliban a little better. Prior to 2001, I think it's true to say that nobody in America heard very much about the Taliban. After November the 11th, everybody knew about the Taliban, but we didn't really know who they were. So who are these people?
It's first of all, thank you for inviting me here. The Taliban movement was originally a movement which arose in the early 1990s as a reaction to the then Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It arose from Pakistan originally, so it was in a way a Pakistani movement, but consisting of Afghan refugees who, escaped from Afghanistan to Pakistan, into the tribal areas of Pakistan. And it originally was actually a student movement, and that's why it's called the Taliban. The Talib means a student. So it was a student movement which was very actively engaged in the situation in Afghanistan, and they wanted to go back and re-establish order and end the civil war that was raging in Afghanistan, particularly after the Soviet forces withdrew from Afghanistan. But today the Taliban movement is something, in a way, something very different, because it's a so fragmented movement. It's not only an Afghan movement, it's not only a movement operating in Afghanistan, but also a Pakistani movement operating with an agenda within Pakistan. So for example, since before 2001, there was not a single Taliban movement oriented towards Pakistan in Pakistan. There was the old classical Taliban movement oriented towards Afghanistan, but there was no Taliban movement with an agenda on Pakistan.
But in Afghanistan, they were the government.
They won the government, and they got control over most of Afghanistan during the 1990s. But after that, and that's what I'm just going to describe here, is that after 2001 we saw the sudden flourishing of Pakistani Taliban movements. So we had, after 2004, approximately 40 different Taliban fractions in Pakistan. So there has been a massive explosion in Taliban affiliated movements since 2001. And the thing that happened in 2001 was, of course, the US-led invasion of Afghanistan.
Well, from the American point of view, the thing that happened in 2001 was the blowing up of the Twin Towers.
Yeah.
And the thing that, as I recall it, got the Americans really, really irritated was that the Taliban government in Afghanistan declined to turn over Osama bin Laden. And that was the impetus for the invasion. We can talk about whether this is justified or not, but of the 40 different segments of the Taliban, which one was in charge of Afghanistan?
No, when I say 40 different factions, I mean the Pakistani part of the Taliban.
Okay.
Yeah. So in Afghanistan we had, I call it the classical Taliban, or the, original Taliban. They of course had control over it. That was the original movement, the movement that arose from a small religious seminary in Pakistan, in the tribal areas and in the northwestern frontier province. they went back to Afghanistan and took control over Afghanistan. But they had, as I said, Afghan roots. They were old. Most of them, at least, were refugees from Afghanistan. But they went to school in Pakistan, and when they grew older, they went back to Afghanistan. But in Pakistan, and that's actually my main my research focus is on the Pakistani side of the Taliban movement. So I know most about the Pakistani Taliban movement. But they find, their own, explanation of why they arose and why they, established themselves is that the U.S. invaded Afghanistan, and the U.S. had no legitimate reason to invade Afghanistan. And that if you look again at the Pakistani Taliban, a second justification of why they think that their violence is legitimate and justified is that the Pakistan army, soon after 2001, it was actually in 2003 and 2004, went into the tribal areas of Pakistan and did some military operations that was seen by the local tribesmen as an illegal invasion of the tribal areas. So that was the second justification, that they reacted against the military invasion in the tribal areas.
So the Pakistani Taliban see the invasion by the Americans of Afghanistan shortly after 9/11 as the illegal event that justifies violence.
Yes. And the Pakistani army's intrusion into the tribal areas.
And why did the Pakistani army do that?
Some would say that it was also, of course, in the interest of Pakistan that the Pakistani military went into tribal areas and got rid of the Al-Qaeda-related activists that were active in the tribal areas or were hiding in the tribal areas. But others would say that it was due to, the pressure from the U.S. that the Pakistan government or the Pakistan army decided to go into the tribal areas.
Yeah. Now you've had conversation with the Taliban.
Yeah.
How is that possible for you to, first of all, in a very Islamic society, how is it possible that they would permit you to come in and talk?
I think basically the Taliban is or the Taliban movement and their, the related activists, they're very eager to tell their side of the story. They feel misrepresented and misunderstood by the world. And I think that when I came as, yes, someone from the West, but someone who could speak their language, someone who could understand their terminology, could, understood their references, then they felt, that's my assumption, more, comfortable speaking with me than with, more ordinary Western journalist who looked more white or, didn't speak the language.
Sure. How many visits have you made?
With my, research, I go there very often. But when I did my, main interviews with the Taliban, it was, I believe, 4 or 5 years ago. I went to Pakistan and spoke to both Taliban leaders, spokesmen, and affiliated activists. And I interviewed them, and that was what I told them, that I'm not interested in knowing anything of intelligence, interest. I just want to hear their side of the story and want to understand why they embrace violence and how they justify their embracement of violence.
So they effectively have come to trust you?
They did at that time. I haven't done some, very recent interviews, but at that time, they opened their homes and door for me. So, I believe they trusted me.
And can you see the argument from their perspective?
Of course, it's very, it's not very appealing, their, justifications of violence or their embracement of violence. Their methods of violence are not particularly appealing either. and every, I think, normal human being would find it very disturbing, what they actually are justifying. But if you take one step away from all that and try to listen to what they say and what their grievances are, there are aspects of it that I can understand. Because when I went to Pakistan, I spoke both with very young people, a young boy, for example, who had embraced the Taliban movement out of different reasons. One of them being that he experienced the drone attacks in the tribal areas. And kids and youngsters and people in general, I believe they get traumatized when they see or when they live in the fear, of drones, or when they live under the constant noise of the drones. We often forget that it's also, it makes a lot of noise. If you have the drones flying over you, it's something which puts fear into children's and youngsters' minds. And when they see that, there are a lot of, civil losses also, I think it mobilizes them into embracing violence. They can't, understand why this injustice. They can't really, they can't understand it from the U.S. point of view.
Sure.
And the interesting thing about, I think, my experience in Pakistan was at that point that nobody mentioned 9/11 or Osama bin Laden as the reason why they are engaged in this war. Or the reason why they're reacting, or the reason why they think that the U.S. is reacting. Their perception of why the U.S. is reacting was that they think that the U.S. is on some kind of mission to attack innocence, or to attack Islam, or to attack their way of life. So the image of we went there to revenge what Osama bin Laden did, or we went there to defend freedom, that's not at all the image that they have of us.
Sure.
And that's what you actually discover when you speak to people face by face. You discover that there's often a huge conceptual gap between the way we see the world and the way they see the world.
Is, in all fairness, is that unique? I mean, I think once the shooting starts, children become afraid. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about the guns of August in 1914 or World War II or Vietnam. I mean, I've talked to Vietnamese children who were traumatized by B-52 attacks. And from my own experience in Denmark as a child, I remember the air raids. And it is traumatizing. War traumatizes, period.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure there's anything unique about that, nor is there anything particularly unique about the costs, because the costs, as perceived by the decision makers sitting in Washington or Islamabad or any place else, are very different than the costs as perceived in the field, where a human body drops dead. That's part of, I think, a part of our reality that we sometimes neglect in terms of understanding why these responses come to us.
But you're probably right that it's not a unique experience in the for the people in the tribal areas or in the northwestern frontier region in Pakistan. But still, I think that listening to their stories should maybe force us to rethink whether our policies are right in that region, or whether our policies are right in other parts of the world, because often we forget that there is an action-reaction dynamics, and we see it as if the history started the day Osama bin Laden attacked us in the U.S. But if you ask them, they don't see the starting point, that it all started 9/11, 2001. They refer far more back to history, and refer to U.S. imperialist policies, historically. So for them, the turning point was not 9/11, 2001, but it has been, other cases, other instances of U.S. policies around the world. So often, again, as I said, there is this huge, we are often worlds apart when it comes to understanding what is actually the reason of this conflict. Mm-hmm. And if we think in terms of conflict resolution, I think it's very important to understand, what is the difference between our perception of the world and their perception of the world, or of the conflict we're engaged in.
I would certainly agree. I mean, I think in contemporary warfare, one of the common characteristics is that each side needs to take action that will demonize the other side. Otherwise, how do you convince 18-year-old kids to pick up a rifle and shoot at somebody they've never met? So they have to be, the other side has to be demonized, be evil. The trick is, once the conflict is over, how do you de-demonize somebody? And that's what you're really about at the moment, as you're now an advocate for having discussions with the Taliban. So if I've heard it, so I'm not making this up, but some American decision makers would say, now why should we talk to the Taliban after all they have done?
Actually, there's, again, my focus is mostly on the Pakistani Taliban, and the debate I have been engaged in has been about whether the Pakistani government should engage in talks with the Pakistani Taliban. But there has also, of course, been a debate about whether the U.S. should engage with, talks with the Afghan Taliban. And the U.S. has actually started to do that since 2012. And Obama has, President Obama, he represents a bit of a different policy line than President Bush did, because I think it was in an interview with the New York Times, he said that I think it's time now to reach out to moderate elements of the Taliban movement. And since then they tried, with some confident building measures, having some track 2 talks behind the scenes. And the Taliban has actually opened an office in Doha, in Qatar, where they have a formal representation, and U.S. officials have been there and tried to at least start some kind of conversation. But all of the conversation or attempts for talks have been a failure until now, because they've been about prisoner exchange and about removing some Taliban leaders from the UN blacklist, and about things that the U.S. had a hard time negotiating with. So the thing is that the most critical voices say that talking with the Taliban is like surrendering to their demands. It's like giving in to terrorist demands, and we shouldn't do that. But the reason the U.S. is still doing something is because now 2014 is approaching, and the U.S. needs successful narrative, and story in Afghanistan. We need to get out of there with some kind of dignity, and being able to tell the story that we did try to reconcile with the Taliban, but it didn't quite succeed. So the whole U.S. attempt to negotiate or talk with the Taliban is framed as an aspect of the end game in Afghanistan. But in Pakistan, there's actually a very huge polarization about that. It's very divided. Most are actually very critical towards the government's attempts to talk with the Taliban. And the reason is, again, that I think it's polemically, framed as a matter of surrendering to the Taliban demands or talking to the terrorists, all that, things which are very, again, demonizing and very little attentive towards the grievances of the militants in Pakistan. And I think that talks and negotiations are actually the only solution and the only way we can end the whole escalation of violence in Pakistan. Maybe not immediately, but it demands listening. It demands that we enter into this give and take situation where we listen to what are actually the grievances of these activists. And some of them are, there are of course many different levels of motivations of the activists, but some of them are drawn into the battle because they lost their mother or they lost some family member in the tribal areas. And there it's of course important to reconsider our policies in the tribal areas. For the U.S. also, should we continue these drone attacks? And what are the consequences of that?
Yeah,
Sorry.
the agenda for any negotiating team has to be at least on two levels, or maybe more. One, of course, is we're here to end the conflict, and what can we say to each other that will build confidence and allow us to trust one another, so that at the end of the day we can call it quits. Then there's the other, which is much more domestic political. And sometimes I have the feeling that some of our leaders say what they do less for international speculation and more for domestic consumption, because my next election depends on what I say today about them. Do you have suggestions for how to cope with that?
I think the situation for the U.S. is much different from the situation for the Pakistan government. Mm-hmm. The U.S. has declared that the combat troops will be out of Afghanistan by the end of 2014. So it's only you can say it's only a limited game for the U.S. Pakistan is left behind with a more large-scale problem. They have to do something about the increased violence in Pakistan, because it's not only now, and I might not have explained that in such big detail, but the Pakistan Taliban movement is not only a tribal area phenomena anymore. The Taliban movement has spread out also to be an urban phenomena. We see it in cities like Peshawar and Quetta and Karachi. So it's a very explosive phenomena all over Pakistan, not something you can just isolate to the tribal areas. So Pakistan has a very real domestic problem and challenge for the years to come, and they have to find a solution, because otherwise the country will just be too unstable, and there will be too much violence raging all over the country.
Now you're about to. You've been working on the development of conference in Pakistan.
Yeah.
To focus on this very sensitive issue. Tell me about that conference. What's going to happen?
Oh, it's a conference on what will happen in the tribal areas, the tribal belt between Afghanistan and Pakistan after 2014, because FATA, which is the federally administered tribal areas, has been a lot in the shadow of the war in Afghanistan. So we are trying to, with my collaboration partner, which is a Pakistani think tank affiliated to the Pakistani Foreign Ministry, we have tried to put together a program to evaluate it from different angles. How can we in the future ensure a better service delivery into the tribal areas? What should be the role of the international community in the years to come? How can we promote a better policy for a particular disarmament of the tribal area and de-radicalization? Because we can see that the military efforts that has been the main component of Pakistani counter-terrorism policies have not been efficient. On the contrary, it has, more Taliban movement has, arisen, and we have seen the, bombastic escalation of the conflicts in Pakistan. So what can we do aside from, these military operation? Is there any other way we can think about counterinsurgency and combating terrorism? And I think the world as such, not zooming out from Pakistan, has to consider how can we combat terrorism in a way which is not doubling the size of terrorist challenges, because we have seen it all over the world. We went into Mali, we went both. I'm talking about Western powers in a more general sense. When we go into try to solve the problem or the challenge of terrorism with military means, it often enlarges the problem and often makes things make it worse. So we have to think in alternative ways, and we have to think about ways to enter into some kind of dialogue, even though that it all seems to be very irreconcilable right now. Or the attitude seems to be very much away from each other. But we can't do. I don't think we can deal with world conflicts if we are not walking that route. The route of dialogue and trying to understand the grievances of our opponents.
You sound very much like an academic who's also an activist. As an academic, you're supposed to observe and analyze and then report what you have concluded. But it sounds to me as if you have also crossed a line and you're simply wanting to affect reality. Is that what you're trying to do?
I think most academics do that, even those who say that they try to keep, neutral. I think it's very important, actually, that we have more, academics interfering into these policy debates, because it's very important for world peace and for the situation, for understanding world conflicts. And if we just think that there is a very, there should be an iron wall between the academics and the, those who really understand the problems on one side, and then the policymakers who can decide on everything in the world, then we have a problem, I think. And I think there should be actually more of course, knowledgeable engagement in the policy world, among academics.
Well, I happen to agree with you.
Thank you.
I'm in hopes that when you come back from Islamabad in this conference, you'll come back to this table and help us understand what happened.
Yes, I would be happy to.
Thank you, Mona Sheikh, for being with us tonight. I'm delighted to have learned a lot about the Taliban and in both Pakistan and Afghanistan. So for Global Dialogue, good night.